When 8 days were completed for his circumcision, the child was given a name, Jesus. And then he was taken to the temple. And after being circumcised, Simeon the prophet took him in his arms. And he blessed the child's parents, saying to them, "Behold, this child is destined for the fall and the rise of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be contradicted. And you yourself a sword will pierce." 33 years, even before Jesus entered public ministry, Simeon the prophet prophesied that he was to be a sign that was to be contradicted, that he was going to cause and create division, that the line was going to be drawn and people were going to have to choose what side of the line they chose to be on. And every day, you and I must choose what side of the line we choose to be on. You know, I think it's been easy to be a Christian in this country, especially the last 50, 60 years or so. Probably not so much the last 10 years or so. But statistically, we're told that prior to the Second Vatican Council, over 70% of Catholics went to Mass on a regular basis. Today, it's less than 30%. And so to be faithful to Christ today is more difficult because times are tougher. You know, the post-World War II years were the most productive years that our nation has probably ever seen or experienced. There were more jobs to be had, there was more money to be made, and the good times, you see, there were good times. People's lifestyle, people's standard of living was getting better all the time. But today it's different. Today it's different. We're living in a culture where things are becoming increasingly more difficult. And one of the things that's becoming increasingly more difficult is to be a faithful Christian, because our culture is becoming increasingly more hostile toward Christians. I read in the news this morning where in Egypt yesterday, a Franciscan school that's run by Franciscan sisters was attacked, and they were paraded through the streets. And it was only because of one woman who gave them refuge that their lives were spared. But the priest wasn't so lucky. Their churches are being burned, and they're being murdered. I recently heard in the news where some woman who owns a little business, a little bakery, couple came to her because they're going to be getting married, same-sex couple, and they wanted her to make them a wedding cake, and she refused because she said it violated everything that she believed in, and now she's being sued. And potentially, quite possibly, could lose her business. Talk about a line. I recently had the opportunity to sit down with someone who just came into the church a couple years ago. You know, they say that converts make the best Catholics, and it's the truth, because converts choose the faith. Many of us are Catholic because it's what was handed on to us. We didn't have anything to say about it. Oftentimes it's a little bit like being Irish. But this person said to me, you know, the Lord is putting it on my heart to step out more and more and more. And so this person is just a little younger than I am, but is quite well placed in his job. Has the opportunity to travel a lot all over the world. And so he's beginning to step out. He said recently he was in a meeting, and you know, people's language today leaves a lot to be desired in a lot of cases. And so someone at the meeting took the Lord's name in vain, and he stopped the meeting and he said, "Please, I would appreciate if you would not take the Lord's name in vain. I do not want the Lord's name in vain to be taken in this meeting." And then it came, the eye rolls. Oh boy, so-and-so's a nut job. So-and-so's a holy roller. But he said, "I really don't care because I'm going to retire in about 6 months." And so I thought to myself, it's very interesting. But then I put the question to him. I said, what kind of a choice do you think you'd make instead of being, let's say, 60, you were 30, had a couple kids, had a mortgage, and your career path was headed upward, and you started to step out, as you say the Lord is calling you to step out in faith. He said, "Well, I'd be labeled." And I said, "Yeah, you'd be labeled. But not only would you be labeled, eventually someone would come to you and say, you need to keep your opinions to yourself. And although they wouldn't publicly and openly dismiss you, or you might not lose your job, you'd be shelved. Your career would be over." And so how many of us have those kinds of choices to make on a regular basis? And we're being called to step out, see? And we don't, because it's easier to keep quiet, because to keep quiet means I'm able to maintain the status quo. I'm not going to upset anybody. I'm not going to upset the apple cart. I like the fact that my career is headed upward. Puts more money in my pocket, gives me more security. And yet if I do step out, if I did step out in faith, and all of a sudden, you see, how would I respond? What would I say to my wife if I came home and said, "Well, I just lost my job because I was faithful to the Lord"? You see, it's not so easy. And yet there are people in the world who are laying down their lives on a daily basis, literally laying down their lives on a daily basis for Jesus Christ. You see, when we walked into this church this morning, we didn't have to walk through picket lines. We didn't have to hide to come to Mass. We publicly came. It was easy. We got up, had a little something to eat, probably took a bath or a shower, got dressed, got in the car, came to Mass. After Mass, we'll go out to breakfast, or we'll do something, but what's it costing me? What's it costing me? I recently read a story about a priest who had left the priesthood and came back because he had a conversion. He had a conversion. Can you imagine that? Was a priest, left, and then had a conversion and came back to the priesthood, and then made this statement. He said, "I want to share with you an experience I had of when I most felt like Christ and I was closest to Christ." And I thought he was going to tell me something about his conversion. But he said that he most felt like Christ and felt Christ closest to him when someone spit on him. Someone spit on him. That's a cause to take a couple of steps backwards and say, oh my gosh, how would I respond? Would I feel like Christ if someone spit on me? What is my response or my reaction when someone persecutes me? And why am I being persecuted for a just cause? For the sake of righteousness? You see, the division that Jesus is talking about has to do with the kind of baptism that he says that he has to experience. He says, I've come to set the world on fire with God's love, truth, and justice. But at what price? What cost? And as disciples, you and I are being called to follow in the same manner. You and I are being called to be a salt of the earth and the light of the world. Why? Because the world has lost its flavor. And so we're being called upon to go out and to evangelize and to catechize. Not so much by the things that we say, but by the things that we do and the choices that we make. The choices that we make. So every day we have choices. Do I choose Christ? Or do I choose my comfort in the status quo that I'm living in the world? You see, it's easy that all I'm going to do is I'm going to come to Mass on Sunday and I'm going to punch my time card for an hour and I can sit here and at the end of the hour I can go home and I don't have to do anything, I don't have to say anything for the rest of the week, I'm good to go. But that's not what it means to be a disciple. You see, Jesus tells us very clearly that we are being called upon to enter the narrow way. The narrow way. And he says the narrow way is broad and smooth is the way that leads to destruction. And many there are who find it. And few there are who enter through the narrow gate of life. And so the second reading tells us that he endured the shame and the persecution of the cross. And so the author of Hebrews asks you and I, are we resisting evil to the point of shedding blood? Has anybody here in the church this morning had to resist evil? Has anybody here in the church this morning had to make a choice for Jesus and it cost blood? I don't think so. And yet there are people who are having to make what I call those radical choices on a daily basis. They have to choose Christ, and to choose Christ costing them their lives. 10-year-old little girl in Egypt this past week, leaving Bible study, somebody shot her. It's not easy to be a Christian where an overwhelming majority of the population is Muslim and they're hostile to its Christians. Hostile to its Christians. And so the Lord is reminding us this morning that to be a faithful disciple means to make the hard choices, the radical choices. How do I respond when people around me are talking in a manner that is unbecoming Do I keep quiet? Or do I say, excuse me, I'm offended by that? You see, because once you open your mouth and you say, excuse me, I'm offended by that, better have your armor on. But are there some things that we really need to stand up for? You know, how many of you, let's be honest, I want a show of hands. How many of you are tired of being assaulted every time you turn your television set on by something that's rated X? What are we doing about it? What are we doing about it? How many of you are tired every time you go to the mall and you walk by the mall and you look into a window, you're seeing some mannequin half undressed? What are we doing about it? You know, I've said this before, but we're living in a culture and a time right now where they use sex to sell toothpaste. That's ridiculous. What are we doing about it? How long are we going to allow the tail to wag the dog? You see, the reason that we're here is because we've been silent for too long. How many of you are aware that potentially, okay, we're living in a time right now, I fully expect to be told that I'm not going to be able to proclaim the fullness of the gospel because I will be accused of perpetrating hate. That's where we are. So guess what? I'm ready to go. How many of you coming with me? Oh, I see a lot of hands right now, but we'll see when push comes to shove. You see, the only way that we're going to be able to make those kinds of tough choices then are to make the little choices that we have to make right now. Nobody takes a giant step. Nobody takes that kind of step. See, the little steps that we take one after the other are what strengthen us and give us the courage that when the time comes and push comes to shove, that we have to stand up, we will. We will. And you know what? Jesus told us in the gospel this morning, you know where it's going to start? Right in our homes. Because the division oftentimes is right in the home, between spouses. I remember when I had my conversion, all I wanted to talk about was Jesus, 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 see? I could turn any conversation into Jesus. My mother said to me one day, you can empty a room quicker than anybody I know. Because not everybody was ready for that kind of truth. I had to learn how to temper, you see, what I wanted to say. You know. But this is where we're at. This is where we're at. And although there aren't any more cisterns today, okay, Jeremiah, you know, he was thrown into the cistern. He was lowered down and had to live in the mud. So although you and I might not have to live in the mud, see, literally, but figuratively, there are all kinds of cisterns that we put people in. We ostracize them, we marginalize them. See, we isolate them, and when you want to be faithful to the Lord, that's what you're going to experience. It's not about coming to church. It's not about coming to church. This is just a building. There's no difference between this building and the building that you live in or the building that you work in. It's about a relationship with Jesus Christ. It's about a relationship with Jesus Christ. And I would bet, before I even ask any married couple in here this morning, okay? Is marriage a lot of work? You bet your life it's a lot of work. You got to work at it every day. You got to work at it every day because no spouse, okay, is going to tolerate you just thinking about them. from time to time. That kind of a relationship cannot be sustained on a couple of minutes here and a couple of minutes there. It's no different with Jesus. It's no different with Jesus. Now is the acceptable time. Today is the acceptable day. If we wait to work on our relationship with the Lord, if we wait until we must have one, it'll be too late. It'll be too late. The line is being drawn right down the center right now. The line is being drawn in the sand. And you and I are not being asked. We're not being asked to choose anymore. We're being told to choose. There are no more fence riders. Everybody's getting kicked off the fence. You got to choose. And so being faithful to the Lord is going to cost. It's going to cost. However, not being faithful to the Lord is going to cost. Do not think, Jesus said, that I came to bring peace in the world. No, 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 no. I came to light a fire. And how I wish that fire were blazing. I came to draw a line in the sand. I came to give everybody the option and the opportunity to choose. And choose we must.